So I'm going to share with you how I discovered a bug in a major WordPress plugin, and how I went about testing for that, and what I was able to communicate to the plugin developer, hoping that they'll fix the issue. So my name is Joel McDonald. I'm with McDonald Web Works. I provide web development, WordPress hosting care, consulting, support services, and what ended up happening, how this all started, was I had a client that was redeveloping their website, and they had like 200 posts and pages that they either wanted deleted or unpublished on the website that they were redeveloping. So instead of them or I going in and deleting each page or post one by one, which would be very time consuming, I said, I'll take this, I'll handle it via command line. So I had basically a spreadsheet of URLs. So one URL for each page or post on the site that needed to be deleted or unpublished. And so in order to use WP-CLI's like delete function or delete command, I needed to convert those URLs to the poster page IDs, because that's what you need in order to use the delete command. And so in order to do that, I was going to use a native WordPress function called URL to post ID to handle that. So all you need to do to use this is URL post ID and then the URL. And so this is going to return the post ID. And so that's what I needed to then feed that into the WP post delete command. And so to show you an example of how that works, we're going to go into command line. And so what I have here is a very simplified version of what I was using for this project. So here we have two lines. We're calling URL to post ID twice with two different URLs. But the thing we need to know is that this URL, or each one of these URLs, is for the same page. It's for the contact page that has a post ID of 13. So obviously we know the post ID here because it's in the URL. But if you have a number of URLs that you're dealing with, instead of like having to manually do that, you should just be able to use URL to post ID in order to retrieve it, regardless of whether it's the sort of normal URL, pretty URL, or whether it's showing the page ID as a URL parameter. So if we run this, what we should get is 13 returned twice for each one of those lines. So let's go ahead and run that. And we get 13 twice, which is perfect. And so what I did is I took, all of the URLs that I was deleting, added them to an array, processed that array to get each one of the post IDs for every URL that I was using. The problem, though, was that when I fed those URLs into WP post delete, the home page that was being developed for the new site was deleted. And we couldn't understand why. It wasn't included on the list of URLs. There was just no rhyme or reason. The only pattern that I could see was that when I went to review the post IDs that I used, I noticed that there was a post ID that showed up multiple times, again, in that list of 100 posts, 100 plus posts that I was deleting. And it showed up whenever a URL parameter was used in the URL. And so I said, oh, well, the function must not work with URL parameters. And so that was the first thing that I looked at. So looking at the documentation for URL to post ID, if we scroll down into the code, we can see they actually do check for that. So they check for page ID parameter, and then they say if that's the parameter, return it. We don't need to do anything else. So the problem wasn't with this native WordPress function. And so I didn't understand why. And so I started testing my code on different websites, and I discovered that when I tested it on mcdwebworks.com, my website, the script worked fine. I didn't have the same problem. The home page wasn't returned. And so what I did was go into the client site, or made a copy of the client site really, and then started deactivating plugins to see if I could find a plugin when deactivated resolve the issue. And I did resolve the issue doing that. And so what I discovered was the plugin that was causing the issue was the events calendar. Now, this is an event management plugin, calendar plugin that's used on over 800,000 WordPress installations. It is a great plugin. I am not in any way knocking this plugin or the developers of this plugin. I will continue using this plugin for current projects and future projects. I think that this issue, affects very few people in very specific circumstances. So this is no way knocking the events calendar or the developers for this. But when this plugin is active, it does return the homepage. So, and I can actually show you that. So if I go to my plugins page on my website, you can see I have the events calendar plugin installed. Let me go ahead and activate it. And then when active, I'm going to go back and rerun this code. Now remember, it should return 13 twice. But when I now run it with the events calendar active, I get 13 and 1,002. Well, what is that 1,002? So if I go into my site and back to my home page, and if I hit edit, I can actually see that 1,002 is the post ID for my homepage. So it returned my homepage as part of that. So if I was to take that 13 and 1,002 and load that into a WP post delete command and WP CLI, my homepage would be deleted. And a lot of people spend a lot of time building out their home pages, and having that lost would be problematic. And that's what happened with my client. Also, let me just say that whenever you are using a delete function of any kind on any project, on any platform, always, 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 always make a backup in case you have issues like this where your process doesn't work how you expect it to, so you can restore that from backup. So that's just good practice. No matter how confident you are in your process or your code, always, always, always make a backup. So I discovered, okay, so the issue is only happening when the events calendar is active on the website. And then I dug a little further into the events calendar documentation and found that they have a filter that effectively was overriding this portion of the events calendar, because what it was doing was before passing it to the native function in WordPress, it was removing the URL parameters or the URL arguments and only returning an empty or URL without those arguments. So, if we take a look at that, this is a URL argument or a URL parameter. If that's removed, the URL that ends up being passed to the native function is this. And what is that the URL for? It's the URL for the home page. And that's why the homepage ID was being returned by that function. And that's why that ended up being a part of the IDs that I included in my delete command. And that's how the homepage was deleted. And so, I was able to basically explain the situation to the events calendar, share with them their documentation on, exactly what was happening as far as the URL arguments being stripped before being passed to the URL to post ID function in WordPress, resulting in the homepage being returned, which, bypasses what the native function is supposed to do. The native function is supposed to return the ID when that ID is present as a URL parameter. So that's what happened. So, I discovered this issue because, I accidentally deleted a page that that obviously we didn't want to delete. And did the plugin testing, which, WordPress developers do all the time to find the conflicts, and then, looking at the documentation for WordPress, looking at the documentation for the events calendar, was able to determine what was going on I communicated that to the plugin developers. It's only been a day and it's the weekend. I'm sure they'll get back to me at some point. Hopefully this is something that can be resolved. Again, I think it's probably only affecting a very few users and very specific circumstances like mine. But this is the kind of stuff in the WordPress community that we should understand is possible. This is a major plugin that has this issue and is one of the premium plugins that I recommend all of the time. And even conflicts like this can happen with these major plugins. So always make a backup. Be prepared to restore whenever you're running any sort of delete functions. And also if you're a developer in this space, communicate with the plugin developers what you find so that they can fix the issue. There have been a couple times that I have helped major plugins resolve issues by reporting back problems that I have found. So hopefully this wasn't too much, and maybe you learned a little something about the space and troubleshooting and finding these issues. Again, Joel McDonald with McDonald Web Works. You can find me at mcdwebworks.com.